to Tokyo Game Life, a Tokyo-based video game podcast focusing on Nintendo and gaming culture in Japan's capital. Your host Mono here to bring you a slice of gaming life from Tokyo. We're getting pretty retro this episode, as I'm joined by Mike, the creator of the Quest 64 official Twitter account, to chat about, that's right, Quest 64. It recently turned 25 years old, and we dig into this game's fascinating legacy. In the feature section, I'm taking you to Tokyo's hidden Nintendo cafe, Hashi, run by former Nintendo employee Toru Hashimoto. The cafe is filled with tons of one-of-a-kind items you won't find anywhere else in the world. It is easily one of the most memorable gaming hotspots I've been to in Japan, and I'm here to give you all the details and give tips on how you can visit. And in the news, I'm going to give 5 predictions on Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Are they spoilers or complete whiffs? Let's get right into the games with Quest 64 and Mike of the Quest 64 official Twitter account. Tokyo Game Life only on the Tokyo Beat Podcast Network. '98 had a lot of groundbreaking video games: Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid, Half-Life. But today, we're not going to talk about any of those games and take a look at another 1998 game that recently turned 25 years old, Quest 64. Joining me to chat about the game is perhaps the world's foremost expert on the game. So, guest, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mike from the Quest 64 official Twitter handle.
Thanks for joining me. For the non-N64 gamers out there, tell us, what is Quest 64?
Quest 64 was just the first traditional, I guess you would say, role-playing game or RPG on the Nintendo 64. That's the way it was marketed. It was developed by Imagineer, a Japanese-based company, but it was first released, like you said, June 10th, 1998 in the Americas first. So NTSCU was the first region to get it, even though it was a JRPG or a Japanese RPG. The only other role-playing games or games that were in that style before Quest 64 in the system would be Wonder Project J2, which is another... That's more of a life simulation, I guess, and that was a Japanese-only release, so North and South America wouldn't have received that game anyway. So this was it for anything even close to traditional RPGs on the system at the time.
You mentioned it. Quest 64 is developed by Imagineer, who is best known for the Metabot series and recently Fitness Boxing on Nintendo Switch. Do you keep up with Imagineer games, or are you purely just a Quest 64 fan?
No, I do like some other Imagineer games, especially in the N64 system, which that's my expertise is in there. They did the Fighter's Destiny series, which I was a big fan of. And they also did Azul Maju Tusei, another RPG that was kind of, well, Japanese only, but also it had a unique battle system with musical notes and kind of capitalized on the Pokemon style of monster collection at the time. But all in all, Imagineer made a ton of games, but not a lot that were similar to Quest 64, I guess.
I remember when Quest 64 came out, and its reputation was that it was pretty infamously bad. Do you think people have been too harsh on Quest 64 over the years?
I do, and as far as it being bad when it came out, most of the reviews actually gave it average or slightly better than average, especially the mainstream. There were a lot of, well, it could be better, but if you look back at what the aggregate score is now, a lot of the magazines gave it a 60% or slightly better into the 70s. Since that time is more when it has developed a kind of a stigma, I guess, as a bad game. And I think that's the problem with internet culture is everything has to be polarizing. So things can't just be good or bad. They have to be the worst or the best. And unfortunately, along the lines through streamers and video game reviewers, Quest ended up on the negative end of that. And I think a lot of those reviews and people talking about the game were just trying to be polarizing and haven't necessarily experienced the game a way a lot of the people who enjoy it did, which is at all.
Right. What's a misconception about Quest 64 that you'd like to clear up?
Well, you touched on it right away. It's just that it's one of the 5 worst games on the Nintendo 64. Anybody who's played it, yeah, it's not perfect. It is far from... It's obviously unfinished. The last third of the game is much more devoid of NPCs and straightforward stories. The story wasn't really fleshed out. We found lots of bits and pieces of possibly full motion videos in the code and things that were meant to be added, and there was regional translations that ended up not going through correctly, so you missed things in the game. But it's not a bad game. It's just
Hmm.
a not perfect game, and a lot of those end up being cult favorites. And maybe that's what I'm trying to push with this game, is that it can be good
Yes.
without being the best.
The thing that sticks out most to me about Quest 64 is the unique battle system. Can you take us through how battles work in the game?
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite things as well. So it is turn based. You select your move, either be a physical attack or a magic attack, and you attack. And then when it's the enemy's turns to attack, they select their move and execute it. But while the physical projectiles or the movement of the enemy is happening, you are allowed to move around in a hexagon or a circle if you're playing the Japanese version. But there's a area where you're allowed to move and physically dodge the attacks using skill, as opposed to relying on a roll of the dice or a random number generator on whether your agility makes you too fast to be missed by the attack or anything. So that adds a certain element of player skill to a game mechanic that is usually just press A, press A, press A, press A kind of thing.
What makes this game stand out in comparison to a lot of the RPGs from its era?
I think that it's thematically, I love that the game has like a bright environment. What I've always
Hmm.
said is that this game captured me because I came from the Super Nintendo and Genesis era right before this, and I played a lot of the Phantasy Star series and like Final Fantasy 2, well, North American Final Fantasy 2. And the games are engaging, the stories are great. We know why those games are great. A lot of the things, like environment wise, like if you leave a city in Final Fantasy 2, instantly your sprite, your character on the screen is the size of the city that you just left. It's a 2D model. So when you're traveling, you're the size of all these things around you, the ships that you get on, the bridges that you cross. Whereas in Quest, you have a much more to scale world. You leave a city, and the trees and the mountains and the city is proportional to you. So it was the first open world ish role playing game that I played where it had a bright environment. It was to scale. The music was amazing. So while the game lacked some story, the immersion was still there because you were playing in this amazing world that obviously nobody had seen before because it was the first game of the series. So
Is there any modern game that you would say resembles Quest 64 in either mechanics or atmosphere?
no, I not really.
Hmm.
Which is kind of disappointing. There are some games that have tried to. I've been pitched a couple actually since starting the Twitter handle to go and try these. I haven't. Maybe there are some that I haven't played, but I miss that polygonal, I don't know, mood, I guess, that was set by the
Yes.
Nintendo 64, which is why I'm such a big Nintendo 64 fan. The only games that I've ever played that were similar only mimic the battle style, and Parasite Eve is one that is normally
Hmm.
brought up because it runs the same sort of like hexagon based free movement battle style. And then I played another game on Xbox 360 which I really enjoyed, called Resonance of Fate, which
Ah, yes.
also kind of does the same sort of thing, but it takes it out in a completely wacky, like hex based world and gun customization thing that it's not the same game. It just has elements that reminded me of my favorite game. So maybe that's why those games resonates with me as well. So
Hmm. Let's say someone starts playing Quest 64 right now for the first time in 2023. What advice would you give to a first time player?
the thing I hear the most is that the game is too well. First of all, it has no tutorial, so it just dumps you
Hmm.
in. You get the first text, and then you're told to go. I'm told at the beginning it's hard, and it's true. If you have no like knowledge of the game at all, it is a little hard. I always liken it to playing like Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior for the first time. To take your time, expect to die, and know that
Hmm.
you'll get sent back to your last save, or what it's actually your last place that you rested, because you actually retain all of your experience and all your leveled up everything that you've gained since the last time you died. So just get used to the grind at the beginning, and then once you get past the first hour and a half or so, it really starts to hit its stride more than the beginning of the game where you're just kind of kicked to the curb and told to figure it out.
The game surprisingly has three completely different names depending on the region: Quest 64 for the US, Holy Magic Century in Europe, and Telltale Monsters in Japan. Do you have a favorite name out of these three?
Oh, yeah, I've always been a fan of Telltale Monsters, not just the name of the game, but also the box art. And even though
Mm,
my Twitter handle is Quest64 official, it almost works backwards. I think that the Telltale Monsters was the best name and box art. It's also the best version of the game. It got some upgrades that
mm.
the North American version didn't have. But then second, I think Holy Magic Century is probably the second best name and the second best box art. So working backwards from release, where North America's probably got the short end of the stick, and it got the really weird 3D render on the cover that people kind of got turned off by because it doesn't look like that in the game, obviously.
Yeah, you mentioned it. The Japanese version of Quest 64 is actually a little different. What are some of the changes from the North American and the Japanese versions?
They did add critical hits, which was a big change. The sign, like, there's a lot of quality of life things. So the signs that you're walking around, and when you see them when you're walking down the street, they're actually legible in the Japanese version as opposed to the North American version, where it's just a bunch of scribbled gibberish. They changed the shape of the battle hexagon to a battle circle, which stopped a lot of the like weird clipping issues that people had trying to escape if a portion of the hexagon was caught on a wall or something like that.
Hmm.
There's just a lot of little additional things. It also has a battery in the cart, which was supposed to be for saving, but
I noticed that you own all three versions: North American, the European, and Japanese versions of the game. Is there any other interesting Quest 64 merch that you own?
yeah, I have some stuff. I have a lot of original print advertisement from different retail stores. I have Quest 64 has its own, if you're familiar with Game Shark, the same company Interact has a memory card dedicated to Quest 64 called a Shark Bite memory card. They come with 15 pre-set up saves along the way, so you can start the game in
Hmm.
15 different spots. I have a sealed retail case of those, so for sealed units still sealed in the case that I have hidden away places. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of little things. I know there's a standee, like a 4 foot tall stand up that I've been negotiating with the gentleman that has the one that I've seen, but I
Hmm.
also have kids and cats and a
Yes.
life outside of Quest 64. So I've always been hesitant about putting big cardboard things in my house. So I haven't quite made that monetary commitment to a large piece of cardboard yet, or found the middle point where it's something that I want to buy. But there's a lot of cool Quest stuff out there. A lot of it just kind of disappeared, like a lot paper, print, and
Hmm.
advertisements and things like that go along. It didn't get a lot of push because it wasn't a first party Nintendo game, so you don't see a lot of the weird tie-in controllers or all the other things you see from Mario, pins and pre-order bonuses, things like that. So I have some stuff, but there's just not that much out there. So
There's another game in the Quest series, Quest Brian's Journey for Game Boy. This was published by Imagineer in Japan, but not developed by them. Have you ever played this game? And if so, what are your thoughts on it?
I have. I actually enjoy that game quite a bit. If you haven't played Quest 64 and that's your first experience, that's probably it, the superior game, I guess.
Oh.
I have different feelings because I started with Quest, and it's a very traditional 2D RPG, so it's a demake of the Quest 64 game. But
Mm.
they do flesh out the story a little more. They fix a lot of the like quality of life things that we talked about with the Japanese version, and they make it more playable. But it lacks a lot of the, for me, the charm that the 3D open world Quest 64 game has. Instead, it's replaced with just a better 2D top down traditional game.
You run a Twitter account called Quest 64 Official. What inspired you to create this account?
I was on the computer trying to pay a parking ticket, and the payment portal of my local municipality's parking authority was down, and it just said to reload a few times. So while I was doing that, I was just scrolling the internet, and it was the exact same time when Elon Musk and the new Twitter management had started advertising that you could buy a blue check mark for whatever it is, $7 or $8. So
Hmm.
I went on Twitter. I don't have a personal Twitter account the Quest 64 is my only Twitter account. So I created that while I was waiting for the ticket payment portal to go because I wanted to see what kind of chaos was happening on the Twitter world at the time. And I ended up sticking around instead of just popping in and leaving. And it caught on quickly, and I
Hmm.
just kind of rode the wave, I guess.
Currently, you have over 8,000 followers. Did you expect so many people would be interested in Quest 64 related jokes and memes?
No, that's the whole answer. I every time I hit a milestone, 500, 1,000, I told everybody I can't believe that this is doing this thing with my favorite game. So I guess I'm going to keep going. We've done a lot with obviously the idea is that eventually we pick up enough steam and get somebody to either want to do a limited run release of the game through
Hmm.
one of the small run companies, maybe like Limited Run Games likes to pick up older games and make Switch cartridges or current gen versions of the game, which would be really cool. Ideally, Imagineer would just decide themselves, since they're the sole owner of the IP, that maybe they want to remake it, even put it on Steam, anything. But honestly, just to raise awareness of the game, and we talked about earlier, I feel like the game has gotten a bad rap, especially over the last 10 years when video game, not review culture, but video game, I don't even know how to put it. Just the people who
Like
just talk about
criticism
video
or.
games, sure, yeah, even without playing it, just people jumping on the bandwagon of talking about games without necessarily experiencing them. So I think giving
Right.
a new generation a completely fresh look at the game would be beneficial for it. And then maybe it wouldn't have such a bad stigma.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, my information about the game is that, oh, it was infamously bad. People say it's one of the worst N64 games, which is, I've played a lot of N64 games and I haven't played Quest 64 yet, but I can definitely like name off some games that are probably much worse than Quest 64. So do you think there's any chance this game gets a re-release in the future? You mentioned that you're trying to push towards somebody getting their attention and releasing it. But do you think something like maybe even Nintendo Switch Online release could be possible?
I would love to say yes, but the reality is no. It's probably never going to end up on the Nintendo Switch Online just because of how
Hmm.
slow they've released games and how
Yes.
they lean heavily towards their own first party stuff or things that they
Hmm.
think people are asking for. What if they were going to release games that were more popular in Japan, like this one wasn't more popular in Japan, but a Japan based company. I could see like the Gomon games being first, or like games like Snowboard Kids, other third party releases that were over the last decade or so more critically acclaimed. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense to go to the unpopular or the less desirable portion of the N64 library first when they've done so few Nintendo Switch Online games.
And final question, if you could pick any developer to make a Quest sequel, who would you want?
I love that Imagineer would just decide they still like the IP and would just do it
Hmm.
themselves. I mean, that I would think that that's the way that it should be. I don't really have a preference outside of that. If you were going to pick somebody that wasn't one of the big names, I would love for like smaller studios like Night Dive that just did the System Shock remake on PC after that game not getting one forever. Little studios like that take the time and appreciate older media would probably be a much better choice than saying something like Capcom
Hmm.
or one of the bigger studios.
Would you buy a Quest version of fitness boxing?
Yeah, I probably would. All jokes aside, I just would just to have it. They also made a curling game over the winter, which really upset me that they're bothering
Oh.
to make things like that, but they can't embrace their older, especially the Nintendo 64 generation of games, because they haven't really touched any of that stuff. They used to
Hmm.
do this.
Yes.
They also did SimCity N64 and SimCity 2000 for the DD, the disk drive on the N64,
Yes.
but they haven't touched any of that stuff recently either. So they're Imagineer's choices recently have confused me mostly because they are still making games. So why would you not make games? Why are you making, like you said, fitness boxing, curling? What is the draw of that compared to games that have an established fan base and nostalgia attached to them?
Well, I'm very happy I got to talk Quest 64 with you. So, Quest 64 official, where can people find you?
That's where you can find me on Twitter at Quest64 official. I do have some other social media that I just don't really use as much. And if we're going to
Hmm.
talk about Quest64, I'd rather have it be there in front of the community where everybody feels like they're part of it. So
Great. And the links to the Twitter account will be in the podcast description, so check it out. Quest64 Official, once again, thanks for joining me.
thank you so much for having me. This was a real pleasure.
Let's take a brief ad break.
Hey everyone, it's David Petrangelo, one of your hosts from Remember 64, the podcast that goes on the totally tubular journey through the Nintendo 64's library. Join us as we dive into classics from Nintendo, Rare, and into the early days of polygons and 3D worlds. Yes, we're covering it all from top of the charts down to the dingy basement and everything in between. We may even find a few hidden gems.
Ooh, intriguing.
Remember 64, only on the Tokyo Beat Network.
That's it for games. Now for the feature on Hashi, Tokyo's secret Nintendo cafe. This episode's feature is a pretty big one. It's definitely one of the more fascinating and interesting gaming-related locations I've visited here in Tokyo. Truly something for Nintendo hardcores, and it offers an experience that can't be replicated. Today's feature is about Hashi, often stylized as H4 Hashi. It's a hidden cafe in Tokyo run by Toru Hashimoto, a former Nintendo employee. You might be thinking, a hidden cafe? What does that mean? Is it a secret? For a long time, its existence was a secret, and even today, the exact location of the cafe is hidden from the public. You won't find it on Google Maps, no matter how hard you try. Even if you have the address, it's still a bit tricky to find, since you won't immediately know you're standing in front of the cafe until you enter. The main draw of the cafe is the collection of one-of-a-kind memorabilia you won't find anywhere else. Specifically the autograph wall, which has unique artwork and signatures from the titans of the Japanese video game industry. I'm talking about Miyamoto, Aonuma, Sakurai, and even developers outside of Nintendo like Ueda and Hori. Plus, there's a ton of trinkets and other collectibles the owner has accrued over the years that are as rare can be. It's a treasure trove for Nintendo fans and retro collectors. A bit of history on the place before I dive into my visit. Hashi was created in 2015 by Toru Hashimoto, who worked at Nintendo in the 80s and 90s. I'll get back to him later, don't worry. The name of the cafe comes from 8-4, the final level of Super Mario Bros., and is a play on the owner's name, Hashimoto. And Hashi also means chopsticks, because it's a cafe, right? Maybe I'm being presumptuous here, but it at least has two meanings. Hashi was originally envisioned as a place where game developers can meet and network in private. It wasn't open to the public. You couldn't just stroll in, and they didn't take reservations. You essentially had to know somebody to get in, and all its clientele were members of the gaming industry, especially those from Nintendo, Hashimoto's former co-workers. So yes, it really did function as a secret club for Nintendo employees for a long time. However, Hashimoto decided to open it up to the public, and starting from late last year, tourists can now enter with a reservation and go on the Hashi tour. This allows you to enter the cafe, have dinner, look around, and talk to Mr. Hashimoto. The price for such an event? 9,900 yen, so about $85 or so, depending on how wacky the currency rate is. That sounds pretty pricey for a dinner, and also it's not a private tour since 2 or 3 groups book each night, but after this segment, maybe you can decide whether or not it's worth it. Now, when I visited the cafe, it wasn't for a tour. I was actually invited to go to the cafe on behalf of Nintendo Life to write an article about it. My experience is a bit unusual since I didn't get a private tour per se, but they let me wander around the cafe to take pictures, and I also got to interview Mr. Hashimoto one-on-one. The article was published in May, so if you want to actually read it, I'll put it in the podcast description. And as a side note, I made a short mini documentary about the cafe for MinMax's Dock Lightning event. So you can watch the video there or on my YouTube channel. So we have an article, my video, and now this podcast segment. I'm really milking this experience for everything it's worth. It took me a bit to find it, even with the address, but when the door opened, the first thing I heard was the iconic Zelda jingle when you complete a puzzle. The cafe in general is steeped in these small little touches that tickle the minds of Nintendo hardcores, or people who just have nostalgia for the 80s and 90s era of gaming. The back wall of the cafe is the main event. It's covered with art, game boxes, and posters, all signed by major Japanese developers. We could really spend all day breaking down each one, but I'll highlight a few of my favorites. The most notable piece is undoubtedly the drawing of Mario eating a bowl of rice with Super Mario 84 written across the top. Drawn by who? Shigeru Miyamoto, with his signature scrawled across the bottom. This is not artwork from a game promo or anything. It's specifically created for the cafe. This place has a ton of pieces just like this, like the one with Pikachu eating out of an 8-4 bowl, signed by Masuda, Omori, Morimoto, and many others from Game Freak. Who drew that one? Oh, just Ken Sugimori, iconic Pokemon artist. I can't stress enough how unique each piece is, and it's not something you can just find a scan of online. There's another great one of Toon Link eating out of a Triforce bowl signed by Aonuma, one with Tingle eating tamagoyaki, and some really stellar Link pieces from manga artist Akira Himekawa and illustrator for the 3DS Zelda titles, Naoko Ayabe. A great non-art piece is the sheet music from Super Mario Bros. 1-1, signed by Koji Kondo. I mean, shouldn't this be in a museum? The newest piece, according to Hashimoto, was a signed boxed copy of Ocarina of Time by Miyamoto. There's a ton of art and signatures from third-party developers as well. Love to Leak is represented with a cool moon drawing. Fumito Ueda, who is from the same town as Hashimoto, has signed copies of his games on the wall. Yuji Horii drew a slime pick, you've got a Mega Man drawing from Inafune, the Street Fighter II dev team is represented, and many others. You can spend a lot of time just staring at the wall, but I do advise you to bring your attention elsewhere too. The other walls are lined with other pieces of interesting memorabilia. One that kind of stands out is the Mother 2 jacket. If you've never seen it, it's a black jacket with dragons embroidered on the back with the Mother 2 logo in the middle. This isn't really super rare. It was sold to the public once upon a time, but it seemed to be a one-off, and the jacket was around $800, so I imagine not too many people have one. But considering Hashimoto worked on Mother 2, aka Earthbound, well, he's first in line to get a free one, I suppose. There's a cabinet that houses a ton of other smaller treasures. The one that will likely draw your eye is the Panasonic Q, a strange chrome GameCube/DVD combo that came out only in Japan. Another thing I liked were these N64 branded lighters given out at E3 in the 90s. How many of these do you think are still out in the wild? I think the rarest item is probably a sticker for the original Super Mario Bros. By sticker, I mean the sticker that goes on the Famicom cart. There's an unused one sitting in the cabinet. Not sure how you would price such a thing, but I can't imagine there are too many of those just laying around. Across from the cabinet is a small shelf with photos of Hashimoto with his peers. Candid shots of Hashimoto goofing around with Miyamoto, Aonuma, Shigesato Itoi, and a really cool group photo from Nintendo of his many co-workers. This small little shelf with personal photos really encapsulates the vibe of the cafe. It almost feels like you've wandered into somebody's living room. It doesn't look like a fancy, modern-themed cafe. It's not like the Kirby Cafe, for example. It's very quaint, very authentic. There is a bar area with a big TV showing retro game commercials, too. I mean, is there anything else you'd rather watch? The bar area is also adorned with a ton of figures and other collectibles. Really, no matter where you look, you'll find something interesting. Even the bathroom's walls are covered in signatures. Food and drink? Sorry, I ironically didn't eat or drink anything in the cafe, but it seems to be pretty typical Japanese cafe food. Now, I've gone on and on about the cafe, the room, the things, but what about the people? Isn't that what's most important? Yeah, it's fun to look at rarities, but one of the best things about visiting Hashi is the opportunity to speak to the owner, Toru Hashimoto. He also goes by the nickname Chokan. He joined Nintendo in 1984, which, yeah, is very early in the company's history as a game developer. You know who also joined at the same time? Takashi Tezuka, Koji Kondo. Those were his peers. Now, those names you know, but why don't you know Toru Hashimoto? Well, because he worked for Super Mario Club, Nintendo's internal debugging team. I believe now they are just called Mario Club. But Super Mario Club often is credited as just that, so Hashimoto's names didn't appear in many titles he worked on. I asked him about this and he said he's fine with it though, as long as Super Mario Club is credited. Hashimoto had his hand in many important games like Yoshi's Island, Earthbound, the Game Boy Pokemon titles. If that's not a murderer's row of games, I don't know what is. He seemingly left Nintendo in the 90s to found his own debugging company, Sarugakucho. The company provided debug and testing work for games both on Nintendo platforms and outside of that ecosystem, including Coldcept for the PlayStation, a series I covered on this podcast. Hashimoto was kind enough to sit down with me for a Q&A interview, which I mostly repurposed into the Nintendo Life article and the video for MinMax. We mostly discussed the cafe and its history at Nintendo. I had to be careful when it came to arranging my questions. I wanted to ask about the cafe as much as possible. I mean, I was invited to cover the cafe and share it with the world. But come on, I'm a huge Nintendo dork. I want to dig into so many things about Hashimoto's time at Nintendo. But I think in the end it worked out pretty well. Around 60% of the questions were about the cafe, and the rest were more nerdy Nintendo questions. Hashimoto was very friendly, but also maybe a bit shy. I think he's still pretty new at this whole talking to random nerds type of thing, since the cafe was under the radar for so long. I asked about the origins of the cafe, and he said that he heard a voice from the heavens telling him to make it. I mean, I can't argue with that. Going from a secret club to a tourist attraction is a big shift, but Hashimoto did say that while he was worried that the atmosphere of the cafe would change at first, he's happy to get to chat to so many people from around the world. Hashimoto said that he gets the most questions about the Mario arch from Miyamoto, and oddly, the Mother 2 jacket. I asked why doesn't he have his signature featured anywhere, but he kind of laughed and said it would be inappropriate to do so. But I do feel that one thing I want to get across here is that Hashimoto is incredibly important to Nintendo's history, even if he's not a well-known name even among Nintendo fans. After talking about the cafe a bit, then I got to dig into my Nintendo questions. Again, this was a hard thing to balance. I don't want to just ask, oh, what was Miyamoto like? Because then you're shifting the focus away from him onto another person. So I wanted to gear it towards examining his personal relationship with his coworkers. When I asked about who he likes to go out drinking with, he told me that at the time, Nintendo didn't have a culture of going out for drinks after work, which was a little surprising. I mean, 1980s Japan, I assumed that's what everyone did all the time. But he did say that once a month he would go out drinking with his coworkers who joined the company at the same time as him, people like Tezuka and Kondo. I think it's pretty wild to have multiple legendary coworkers. Have you ever worked with somebody who's legendary? Probably not. Next, I wanted to do a little game where he describes his past collaborators with one word. I thought this would be something that nobody else would ask, and it would get some good sound bites. I was a bit worried that he wouldn't like it, but he graciously played along. Now, looking back, I realized that this was kind of poorly phrased because one word in Japanese does not equal one word in English. So it backfired a little bit, but instead of one word, I can just say one phrase, right? Here are his answers. Takashi Tezuka, Nakayoshi, or close friend. So yes, this one word thing has already flown out the window. Eiji Aonuma, Nomi Tomodachi, or drinking buddy. Junichi Masuda, Kokoro no Tomo, or kindred spirit, which is a very poetic answer. Shigeru Miyamoto, Dai Senpai, which is both super easy to understand and hard to translate. I think a lot of people know the word senpai, so Dai Senpai is like great senpai. But I believe I translated it as my great senior, which is kind of a clunky phrase in English, but it's basically somebody he looks up to a great deal. Finally, Shigesato Itoi, onjin, another very hard word to translate in English, but it means somebody you're indebted to. I think through these answers, you can kind of understand how closely he worked with these people and why so many of them were eager to contribute to the cafe in some way once Hashimoto opened it. I also asked, what was the hardest game you had to debug, which to me was the most important question. This was the thing I wanted to know the most about, some weird piece of quirky Nintendo trivia that nobody else on Earth knew. His answer? Kirby's Block Ball, a breakout clone for the Game Boy. He said it was because it was difficult to ensure that the player's aim and the movement of the ball were in sync. Block Ball is a very simple game on the surface, but it does require more physics than most Game Boy titles when you think about it. Finally, the big closer, what does he want people to get out of the cafe experience? He said that he wanted to bring people closer together through their love of video games. Since a lot of the members of the tour groups are strangers, talking about games lets them create some sort of bond. A sweet answer, and it also highlights what's great about video games, sharing and talking about them. Now the big question, is Hashi worth visiting? For me, a hardcore Nintendo fan, definitely. Being able to talk to somebody who worked at Nintendo during my childhood is an invaluable experience. Plus, I got so many great pictures and videos of amazing one-of-a-kind items. But again, I went for free. You have to assess that if you're willing to pay nearly $100 to spend a few hours in a cafe, especially if you're a tourist with limited time. I think if you are listening to this podcast, you're probably a deep in the sauce hardcore Nintendo fan, and to those folks, I say absolutely go here if you're in Tokyo. You can Google 84 Tour, and they have an English page to help guide you. It does fill up, so try to reserve maybe a month ahead of time, if possible. If you want to read more, check out my Nintendo Life article, and check out my YouTube channel for a little mini video about the cafe. Plus, I'll be spamming pics on Twitter for the next week or so. That's it for the feature. Now, let's look at the news. About 2 weeks ago, we had a big boy Nintendo Direct. Normally, I'd break down every little part about it, but I mean, it happened almost 2 weeks ago. Instead of some long analysis, I want to give my brief thoughts on it and then give 5 predictions about Super Mario Bros. Wonder. My overall thoughts on the Direct, honestly, better than I expected. I think it's pretty clear Nintendo is gearing up for their next piece of hardware, so I was honestly surprised we were getting so many new first-party titles when Switch 2 could launch within 18 months. If they're not saving these big games for Switch 2, I'm really curious about what kind of software this successor will have. The big three for me were obviously WarioWare Move It, Super Mario RPG, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. All three of those games released in a 6-week span, which is pretty strange. But that's honestly a really strong holiday lineup, along with Mario Kart, Pokemon, and Splatoon DLC. Nintendo really could just dip after Pikmin 4 and still rake in a lot of cash this holiday season, but instead we are getting some pretty big notable titles. For the third-party announcements, Star Ocean 2 got my attention, but my JRPG backlog is truly insane, so I have no idea when I'll get to this one. Alright, now for 5 predictions on what I consider to be the most exciting announcement, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, a brand new 2D Mario game. Perhaps you could consider it the spiritual successor to the new series. I love the new games, and U is easily one of my favorite Mario titles. If we're talking 2D games, World is number 1, and U is likely number 2. But the new series kind of went as far as it could have gone, so a brand new 2D Mario game divorced from the previous one is really exciting. Let's get right into the predictions. I might as well swing for the fences here, so prepare for me to go 0-5. Prediction 1. Playable Pauline. Like in 3D World, I can see us unlocking another playable character. Rosalina is the most obvious since, yeah, that's who you unlocked in 3D World, but Pauline would be a bit more fresh and interesting. We already know we can play as Daisy and even Yoshi, so Wonder is really set out to break Mario conventions. A playable Pauline would be really exciting since you could completely reinvent and establish her moveset. She played a big role in Odyssey, one of the seminal Switch games, so Pauline becoming playable in one of the final huge Switch releases would be really poetic. Prediction 2. Every level will have a Wonder Flower mechanic. From the video, it seems that the Wonder Flower activates some change in the level, like moving pipes or summoning that horde of buffaloes. I think a big theme of the game is, of course, wonder, so they want to constantly surprise players and make them wonder what's going to happen with each new level. Nintendo is typically pretty economical when it comes to assets, but I would not be surprised if each level has a completely new wonder scenario that isn't duplicated. For example, the wacky pipes are only in that one level. We saw a lot of different examples, such as the missile barrage, the hippos bouncing around, so I think there's going to be a ton of these wacky situations thanks to the Wonder Flower. Prediction 3, you will be able to use the purple coins to unlock things in shops and elsewhere. Oddly, unlike coins, they have a decimal point, like 12.3. But it does seem that each decimal point is one coin. It's a little strange to implement this only for the purple coins, so I'm not sure what the reasoning for that is, but maybe they want to keep that number a bit more manageable when you spend them. So 20 coins instead of 200, for example. As for what you'll unlock, I can see things that manipulate the world map in some way, like unlocking alternate paths or new levels. Also, maybe you can unlock some things related to character customization. We see Yoshis in the trailers with multiple colors. Maybe those colors are something you can buy from a purple coin store, and perhaps Mario and crew will have other aesthetic unlockables. Prediction 4, there will be other animal power-ups outside of the elephant. The elephant is on the cover, and that was the big closer for the trailer, but I think that won't be the only one. Right behind Mario, when he grabs the elephant apple, there's a silhouette pattern of an elephant right behind him, so I think that this is kind of odd. But I can see them replicating this for other animal power-ups. Like if Mario turns into a tiger image will appear behind him. It seems strange to use this background for only the elephant power-up, so it's got to be part of a theme. And the final prediction, I think the Koopalings are going to sit this one out. They were so prominent in the new series, but I can see Nintendo wanting to differentiate this game a bit more, so they are moving away from a lot of the new conventions. Bowser Jr.? There is an enemy that looks pretty similar to him in the trailer, so I think that he could appear to help out his dad, of course, but maybe Bowser's recruits this time are some local baddies to replace the Koopalings, since it looks like Wonder doesn't take place in the Mushroom Kingdom. So those are 5 predictions for Super Mario Bros. Wonder. These are a bit tough to do since, they could add anything. Mario could turn into a helicopter. That's a harder thing to predict than, there will be time travel in Zelda. Either way, Wonder is my most anticipated game of the year. Okay, that's all for this week. Thanks as always for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite app. Leave a 5-star review as well. It really helps with visibility. The podcast is also available on YouTube, so like and subscribe there as well. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Just search for tokyogamelife or find the links in the podcast description. If you like the podcast, be sure to share with your friends and on social media. And if there's anything you want me to talk about or cover, don't be shy, just message me on Twitter. The next episode will be on July 16th. See you next time. Matane!